Hola, muy buenos días a todas, a todos. Hoy es el última plática, la última charla de nuestro ciclo de charlas Sesgos Narrativos de los Cuerpos, Tecnologías de la Justicia y el ADN. Y bueno, pues estamos muy contentos de tener el día de hoy a la doctora Clare Allely, quien pues nos va a presentar y nos va a compartir un trabajo que consideramos sumamente relevante en el contexto de lo que nosotros hemos venido tratando como sesgos narrativos, como las preguntas sobre qué pasa con todas estas miradas a la conducta delictiva o a los actos delictivos o a la acción delictiva desde pues diferentes perspectivas, ¿no? Ya hablamos de pues la sociológica, la genética, la afectiva, pues la social en general, la artística, y el día de hoy ella pues nos va a hablar desde la perspectiva de la salud y concretamente de la salud mental. Entonces, bueno, pues voy a hacer su presentación, le voy a decir, voy a leer su semblanza en español y luego la conversación, su presentación va a ser en inglés. La doctora Clare Allely es docente de psicología forense en la Universidad de Salford en Inglaterra. Es miembro del Centro Gilbert de Neuropsiquiatría en la Universidad Gothenburg de Suecia. Es asociada del Centro de Justicia para Niños y Jóvenes en la Universidad de Strathclyde. Clare actúa como testigo, perito experto en casos criminales que involucran acusados con trastorno de espectro autista. Su investigación se centra en cómo ciertos rasgos del trastorno del espectro autista pueden mostrar el contexto de vulnerabilidad para cometer un rango amplio de comportamientos ofensivos, incluidos conductas terroristas, el consumo de imágenes infantiles inapropiadas, masacres colectivas, masacres escolares, ofensas sexuales, cibercrimen, violencia, zoofilia e incendios provocados. Es autora del libro The Psychology of Extreme Violence, a Case Study Approach to Serial Homicide, Mass Shooting, School Shooting and Lone Actor Terrorism, publicado por Routledge en 2020. Y su libro más reciente, Autism Spectrum Disorder in the Criminal Justice System, A Guide to Understanding Suspects, Defendants and Offenders with Autism, también publicado por Routledge en 2022. Okay, so welcome, Clare. Thank you very much for being with us. We are very excited. We were really looking forward to hearing you today. And a little bit of what I was saying before is just trying to re-elaborate what has happened during the last week. The object of this group of talks, a series of talks, has been basically talking about what happened with crime. You know, like so we have been talking from the sociological perspective, the affective perspective, the artistic perspective, the genetics perspective, biological perspective. So basically what I was trying to re-elaborate and recapitulate was that we are trying to consider all these different perspectives that have something to say about crime, and that we need to understand also how they are biased by their own, sometimes by their own methodology, you know. So we are very happy to have you here. I won't take more time from you because we really want to hear you now. And if it's okay, we were planning like about an hour, maybe 50 minutes, an hour to hear you, and then we will have a small dialogue with Agustín and some of the people in the audience who are willing to ask you or to comment what you have just presented. Okay, thank you, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I could kind of halfway follow it, even though it was in Spanish, I think, which is quite interesting. But thank you very much for that. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today to speak to you all about this topic that I'm really passionate about, autism spectrum disorder in the criminal justice system. Now, in my work, I focus on all aspects of the criminal justice. So I'll look at how autism can provide, or certain features of autism can provide the context of vulnerability to engaging in a range of offending behaviour. I'm also really interested in the context of a police investigative interview, what vulnerabilities an individual with autism may have in that environment. And again, I'm also really interested in autism in the prison environment, on autism in the courtroom in particular. And I'll talk more about that today as well as we go on. So just trying to go into the next slide. Oops. Oh, there we go. Before I kind of go into this topic, I really want to kind of highlight two books I've had published that Claudia mentioned there in the introduction. I want to particularly focus on the one on the right. I think this is a really important text because no book to date has really done what this covers. And what it does is it takes each different type of offend behaviour, like cybercrime, arson, violent offending, sexual offending, online sexual offending, you name it, the whole spectrum of offend behaviours, and really unpicks what are the features of autism that might provide the context of vulnerability to engaging in those different types of offend behaviour. There's a couple I'm going to focus on today to give you some examples and insight into this. One is sexual offending of a hands-on nature, and the other is lesser well known in relation to autism, but autism and the viewing of indecent child imagery, sometimes called child pornography. So I think this book's really important, and I think it really helps clinicians and others, in particular lawyers, really understand how autism can be, in some cases, a potential mitigating factor in a defendant with autism. Just to kind of be inclusive, I'm just going to kind of give you a brief synopsis of what autism spectrum disorder is. Autism spectrum disorder is a condition or disorder which is characterised by impairments in two core domains. One of those domains is impairments in social communication and interaction. So the person will have difficulty with maybe engaging in interaction with another person. It's it's got reciprocity, it's real two-way, and it's not just, whereas many people with autism, it can be a very one-way dialogue. They may struggle to understand social cues from other people as well, and so that can really impair their ability to interact with others. There's also impairments in another domain, and that's of restrictive and repetitive behaviours, interests, and activities. So this is beyond what you typically expect in neurotypicals, where you've got an interest in a certain football team or a certain band, music band. And it's beyond that. It's with someone with autism, the restrictive interests and repetitive behaviours are so encompassing. They're all pervasive to that person, to the point where it actually interferes and impairs with their everyday social functioning, and can actually even impact on their occupational functioning as well. So it's beyond just a typical strong interest that a neurotypical person may have. I think it's also really important to acknowledge in an autism field that no two people will present the same. Like, there's so many different permutations of how autism can present. You'll never ever get a person that's got identical set of particular weaknesses or impairments. Many will be familiar, there's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health and Diseases. This is a kind of diagnostic Bible, if you like, that helps clinicians guide them in diagnosing. So it's a set of criteria for a range of different disorders, and one of them is autism spectrum disorder. In this DSM, it categorised autism as being a spectrum, so from very severely impaired individuals to very high-functioning individuals. And they categorise this according to three different domains: high-functioning, autistic, so moderately impaired, level 2, and then severely impaired, level 3. I think it's really useful to look at autism in this way in terms of identifying the needs that a person has, like what level of support they need to be able to function independently. However, I think looking at autism in a spectrum way is actually really detrimental in a forensic context. I think it really gives the impression that someone who's high functioning autistic and is being charged with an offence, that somehow they're high functioning, their autism isn't that impairing, therefore it's not worthy of considering. So I've heard a lot of defence lawyers say it's immaterial to the defence of that individual. They're high functioning, they can speak very articulately, they've got a professional job. This is not a mitigating factor in any form or fashion. I think this idea that autism is a spectrum really kind of supports that kind of misconception. I think in a forensic context in particular, it's more important and accurate to look at autism as being a profile of both strengths and weaknesses. I think a really good way to kind of look at this is through this pie chart here. So on this slide, you'll see hopefully a kind of pie that's got different pieces, and different pieces of that pie reflect different features of autism that can be impaired in an individual with ASD or autism. So you've got sensory sensitivities. So an individual with autism may be hyposensitive to certain sounds, textures, smells, and sights. So they may seek them and seek certain textures and smells, but they can also be hypersensitive, so they can actually find it aversive and very distressing, certain sounds or smells or touches, etc. There's intense focus and interest, communication difficulties or impairments, social impediments, and routine and repetition in either activity or behaviours or interests. To kind of typify how autism can be a profile of both strengths and weaknesses and how it's different in every individual, on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see 3 hypothetical individuals with autism. Hypothetical person A, you can see, is extremely impaired relative to person B and C with regards to intense focus and interests, but relatively unimpaired compared to person B and C with regards to their communication difficulties or impairments. So someone presenting autistically like A, they wouldn't be necessarily immediately seen as vulnerable in a police interview context or a courtroom scene or when they meet with their defence team because they are so verbally articulate. Yet it's hiding or masking the fact that there are other features of their ASD that is significantly impairing and is provided a significant context of vulnerability to engaging in their offending behaviour. So for instance, hypothetical person A, it could be their particular intense focus and interest were in a topic that was inappropriate or indeed illegal. So for instance, an example in the literature of a young man with Asperger's who was really, really preoccupied and intensely interested in subways and trains. And in order to pursue this particular strong interest that he had that was all pervasive, he would engage in this activity to the expense of other things like meeting friends, going out and eating for lunch, etc. Such was his pursuit of this interest that he actually hijacked a train and started, literally doing the job of a train conductor, etc. He was also directing traffic on the road like a police traffic warden. So I think this really highlights that it's so important not to see the person as being highly functioning and very articulate and ignore any other aspect of their autism. So, literally saying, I've seen as an expert witness in criminal cases, I've seen time and time again, guys with autism, typically where their defence team has said they're high functioning, it's immaterial to defence, we're not going to explore it. But this really highlights that there can be other features that are really important to look at. Person hypothetical C, on the other hand, would more likely to be perceived as immediately vulnerable in a forensic context like a police investigative interview or a courtroom scenario. I think it's really important to note and stress here that when I talk about autism in relation to offending behaviour and the criminal justice system, what I'm not saying is that people with autism are more likely to engage in offending behaviour. One of my favourite studies that really, really supports this is a study by Hitler published in 2010. What they did was they had 177 adult males with autism, and they looked at these adult males over the course of 22 years. So it was a longitudinal study. And they found that in the course of that 22 years, the 177 adult males had carried out were convicted 33 times. There were 33 convictions. And of the ones that were more violent in nature, there were 3 cases of bodily injury, 1 case of violent threatening behaviour, and 1 case of robbery. This led the researchers to strongly argue and conclude that this was no different to that found in the general population. So therefore, really supporting this notion that people with ASD are not more violent. Despite this, there's been a lot of media around this topic, really kind of serving to to kind of give this idea that there is an association that if you're autistic, you're going to be more violent, particularly when we see cases of mass shooters or school shooters whom have been autistic and have carried out an attack. And there's this idea that there's somehow an association between the two. There's absolutely not. And in fact, there's been increasing number of studies finding that people with ASD are actually less likely to engage in offending behaviour than neurotypicals. And this does make sense because many people with autism, they like routine, they like a structure, they like rules to follow. It kind of helps them make sense of an otherwise socially chaotic world. So they can say, if they're struggling to kind of figure out how to work and how to interact with others, they can use this set of structure to navigate the world. So the law provides that for them as well. So deviating from that law can cause distress and anxiety. And indeed, there's many cases of people with ASD that when they see other people breaking the law, they actually interject to try and stop that from happening or to highlight that to the person that they are breaking the law. And they do this without necessarily recognising the potential implications of doing so, like how people might react very negatively, such as their just pursuit of this. So, of very strong sense of social justice in many people with ASD. So I think this is a really important point to make. It's also really important to note that in people with autism or autistic people, very rarely do they just have autism. It's actually the exception rather than the norm. So many people with autism, they tend to have other diagnoses or other current conditions. And there's many common ones such as anxiety and depression, other neurodevelopmental disorders such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, Tourette's syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorder, sensory integration disorder. And increasingly I'm finding in my research that many people who go on to carry out acts of extreme violence tend to also have psychosis. And this is very interesting as there's been some studies that have found that in people with autism and psychosis, they're far more likely to act on their psychotic impulses than if they just had autism by itself. So this really does show that having other co-occurring conditions can further exacerbate that person with autism's ability to cope with everyday stressors and difficulties, etc. And so what's been argued in the literature is that many of the co-occurring conditions in people with ASD that go on to offend are what is really driving the offending behaviour. So I've mentioned that people with autism are more likely to engage in offending behaviour than the general population. However, what's important to look at is the fact that in the small subset of people with autism who do offend, it statistically tends to be certain types of offending behaviour, and these are commonly threats to kill, arson or fire-setting behaviour, sexual offending across the whole range, criminal damage or damage to property, for instance, and stalking behaviour. So this really led me to think that, well, if people with autism are more likely to offend than the general population, but in the subset of people that do offend, it tends to be certain types of offending behaviour, then why is that? Why is it these particular ones that many people with autism, if they do offend, it tends to be these ones? Why is that? And so hopefully in this presentation, I'll kind of unpick why that may be the case. There are a number of risk factors and vulnerabilities in people with ASD or autism, and one of the key ones that I've mentioned are co-occurring conditions and other co-occurring comorbidities, psychiatric comorbidities. But there are other ones as well, and some of these I've listed here. And I've mentioned one already, pursuing a preoccupation. So an example I gave earlier of the man with autism that had a real preoccupied interest, autistic fixated interest in trains and subways, to the point where he hijacked a train. He is pursuing that interest, and because of his autism, and it was so intense that he was not able to appreciate the wider perspective and the implications and consequences of engaging in that action. So effectively, many people with autism that offend, they tend to have an impairment in the ability to recognise cause and effect to their behaviour. If I do this, it'll mean that. If I make this statement to someone, they're going to feel like that. They often can find it very difficult to kind of understand what impact their behaviour or actions will have on others. Many people with autism also have sensory sensitivity. So I've mentioned already they can be hyper, so they seek certain sensory things out like touch or smells or certain sights, but they can also be hyper, where they find they're aversive, and this can be really extreme. We often find things that are kind of like bad smells and we'll be like, oh my god, that's awful, But in someone with autism, it's like extremely distressing. And some examples could be like when you're in a shower. Some people with autism who have a hypersensitivity to touch, their fingers on their head as they're kind of rubbing in the shampoo, it can feel like razor blades, such as how aversive and detrimental these kind of sensory sensitivities can actually be. There's also social naivety. So there's many cases of people with ASD who are actually carrying out offending behaviour on behalf of their so-called friends, and they do not know and appreciate that what they've done is wrong. They think that, I'm doing a good thing here, and they're asked to do something, but they don't necessarily appreciate the hidden agenda of that person, how they're being manipulated. An individual with autism also has an impaired ability to put their mind in the perspective of another person. So this is called theory of mind impairment or difficulties. So this is the ability to understand that someone else has different thoughts and desires and beliefs and intentions to themselves. So if someone feels like this, you can understand how it can be a vulnerability factor to engaging in offending behaviour. Take the example of a person with autism that is impaired in this. If they find something really enjoyable and they're really liking it and think it's okay, think it's appropriate, then they won't understand that someone else might actually have a completely different set of views from that they'll actually find that aversive or distressing or upsetting. So in the context of like a sexual offence, if they touch someone and it's inappropriate touching, but they think that person likes them and they've misperceived the cues of that person and think the person likes them because they smelled at them and they're interacting with them and they can't pick up on social cues that person's distressed, but they're liking the person, they're attracted to the person, they won't necessarily think that their behaviour will be viewed as anything other than what they're feeling it as being good. I hope that makes sense. I know it's kind of jibber-jabbery. Another thing that's kind of often overlooked in autism is that they can have emotion regulation difficulties. So there's a high degree of impulsivity in this group. So they can act in a very impulsive manner. Like, say, for instance, there's a horrible aversive sound that's very distressing and they might lash out without thinking, for instance. Or if they think someone's looking at them inappropriately, they might view that as being aggravating and the person's very threatening, and they may react in a very reactive way to that, what they're perceiving as being really aggressive potentially. And what's interesting here is that many people also that they can act impulsively, but afterwards when they reflect on it, they're like, oh, I actually realised that, what happened there, and I realised that my reactions were disproportionate to the event. But in that moment, there's that impulsive aspect to the autism often. I've also written the word alexithymia here at the bottom of the slide. This is not a disorder. It's not in the DSM-5, Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health and Diseases, but it is a trait condition. And what it means is that the person has difficulty with identifying and describing their internal body states and emotions. So if you were to ask someone with autism, or anybody, you don't have to have autism to have this particular trait, but if you were to ask someone with alexithymia, if when they're really happy, tell me, how do you feel right now? Describe your feelings. They would struggle. And it's even to the point, as I mentioned, that it's internal bodily states as well that they can struggle to identify. So often people with this particular trait, they might not recognise they're really hungry or need to go to the bathroom until it's really, really far down the line, for the want of a better expression. What's been found in the literature is that in people with autism who offend, and also people with autism more widely, the rate or presence of alexithymia is around about 40 to 50% of this group. So I think, again, if you're a person who struggles to kind of recognise that you're getting really kind of upset at something and you might lash out, or you can't describe how you're feeling, so to the point where you can't control maybe some of those feelings, moderate them to some degree, you can understand how that can be potentially a vulnerability factor to offending behaviour in some cases. I'm going to give an example of fire-setting behaviour or arson behaviour and how someone with autism might be drawn to that behaviour. So what specific aspects of autism might make that person with autism more vulnerable to this? I wrote a systematic review on this particular area a couple of years ago, And what I found was that there are some factors or features of autism that can lead someone with autism to engage in this offending behaviour, but without realising that what they're doing is illegal or what they're doing is potentially harmful to others. So again, the theory of mind, the not appreciating the potential impact on others with their actions. Also, some of these cases in the literature where people with autism have used fire setting as a means to solve problems. So there's a case in the literature of a young man with autism who had this radio station that he absolutely was fascinated with, and would tune in for a couple of hours every evening. But a local radio station started up and it interfered with the transmission of his favourite radio channel, and he couldn't listen to it anymore. And he sent this radio station numerous letters, but they kept on ignoring them. And so after months and months of this, he just built up to the point where I need this so much. This is my restrictive interest, not using those particular words, but this is my everything. This means everything to me, this radio station. What can I do to be able to listen to it again? So the only thing he could think of was setting fire to that radio station to kind of eliminate them. They can also have impaired victim empathy. So not necessarily recognise, automatically consider the impact potential on others about their actions, that they might actually hurt people, that they might actually lose control of that fire, and it might actually cause damage to property and people's homes. I think it's really important to point out here that I speak very fast, I do apologise. I think it's really important to point out here that there's a misconception that people with autism have a lack of empathy. This is definitely not the case largely. Rather, it's more important to look at autism as being two different types. You've got cognitive empathy. So this is the ability to understand and recognise, if I do this behaviour, this will make the person do this or think this or feel this. So it's like a cognitive understanding about the impact of their behaviour on others. Then you've got affective, or social empathy. And this is the ability to naturally resonate with the feelings of others, the subjective experience of others. So what's been argued in the literature is that people with autism are impaired largely in their cognitive empathy. So the ability to recognise cognitively that if I do this, this will make the person think this or feel this. But they're not impaired in their affective empathy. So once it's explained to them the impact of their actions or their offending behaviour, because they do have that affective empathy, they're like, oh my God, I can't believe what I did. And you often hear in some people with autism where their offending behaviour is being driven by their SD features, for instance, that they do go, oh, I feel sick to my stomach, I hadn't realised, and they're absolutely traumatised by what they've done. So I think it's really important to recognise that people with ASD are not unempathetic. And the reason why I stress this is because in many cases that I've been involved with and cases I've heard about, it's really misperceived that people with autism are like psychopathic, that they're cold and remorseless and they have no feeling. This is not the case. They maybe not express it in the same way that a neurotypical would. And also they don't have the cognitive empathy potentially or impaired in that, but they do have that affective empathy. I think even more critically in how certain features of autism can provide the context of vulnerability to fire setting or arson is the sensory appeal of fires. For instance, for some people with autism, they may be really drawn sensory to the heat or the flicker or the flame. And there is cases in the literature where there's been young men that have been charged with arson in adulthood who have a long history of a preoccupied interest in fires or flickering flames. One example was a young boy who later committed arson in adulthood, who would sit for hours in front of the boiler, the kind of pilot boiler thing where you can see a wee flickering flame all the time, for the heating system. And he would sit there for hours and hours at a time, totally captivated by this wee flickering. Again, directly linked to the autistic preoccupied interest. So that's an example of arson. I'm going to talk about a couple of cases of people with ASD who have been charged with sexual offending and how their features of ASD may have contributed to that behaviour. So the first one is a case from Milton and colleagues in 2002. This was a man who was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and he was convicted of 3 different types of sexual offending behaviours: acquisitive offences, direct sexual assault, and indirect sexual assault. This man had a long fascination with women's genitalia. Now, some of my students are like, well, Claire, don't all heterosexual males have a long fascination with women's genitalia? And I would say yes, largely, but in people with autism, it's really important, as I mentioned already, that it's the intensity of it and pervasiveness of that interest that really separates it from a neurotypical strong interest. And this young man had a particular fascination with the idea, an image of a woman being gynecologically examined by a doctor. And in order to pursue this restrictive interest that he had, he would pose as a medical researcher and go online to women and make inquiries about their experiences of being gynecologically examined. And he would go into significant detail and how did they feel, etc. And he would frequently masturbate during these calls as well. So with this man, it was recognised when they had experts in, etc., that it was his autism and his restrictive interest that was really, making him very narrow-minded and not able to see the wider impact of his actions, unable to kind of understand that actually the women he was talking to were actually victims of his behaviour. Again, the theory of mind aspect, if he's interested in it and thinks it's okay and is, finds it, has a real need for it, then the idea that someone else might have a different view to that or would think that wrong, that pursuit of that behaviour would be almost incomprehensible to that person with autism. Some other cases from another paper by Haskin and Silva was a guy who was a substitute teacher. He was called Mr. B, and he was kind of apprehended because he was like touching the shoulder of a number of adolescent female students. In this case, it was recognised that this was a compulsive aspect of his autism, like it was a version of restrictive and stereotype behaviour. Another point I would like to make here is you often hear in relation to autism about stimming behaviours, S-T-I-M-M-I-N-G. So stimming behaviours is like hand flapping and things like this. So you often get people with autism that might sit there and hand flap. And they do that to try and soothe themselves. So it's a restrictive, repetitive hand motion that they engage in times of particular anxiety or stress. And it's like it regulates them, that kind of repetitive action. And it can take a number of different types, that kind of stimming behaviour in people with autism. It can be touching like that, or it can even be smiling. So you just smile when you're anxious because you don't quite know what else to do, and you just might. And so again, there's been many cases in the literature of defendants with autism who have been really concerned about the fact that they do sit and smile when they're really stressed, and how they recognise that is inappropriate and might be perceived very negatively, but they just can't control it. It's just something that they just have to do. Another really interesting case, and I'll speak about this in more detail, is the case of Mr. C. This was a deaf man who was referred for outpatient psychotherapy because of displays of inappropriate sexual behaviour. So what this man was doing was he was compulsively, again linked to his autism, it was compulsive and very restrictive and repetitive, soliciting strange men that he did not know for sexual contact. He did not appreciate that other people might view that as being really weird and they might react hostilely to that. And indeed, in one case, when he went up to a man and solicited them, this man was reacted very badly to that and attacked him, physically assaulted this deaf man for doing so. In relation to the same man, Mr. C, just going into more detail here, it was really interesting that he did not appreciate that what he was doing was wrong. He did not understand it was illegal, that this soliciting of men they didn't know was odd in any way. He thought it was completely normal behaviour. Just to kind of highlight just how naive and his lack of appreciation of what he was doing was wrong, when he was asked about, do you have any friends, etc., he would often say, oh, nobody came round to my flat the weekend. And they would ask, well, but did you invite anybody to come round? And he'd be like, well, no. So it's like, well, how did you expect anyone to come round and if you didn't actually invite anybody? Also, during role plays with this man, they would ask him to role play meeting someone for the first time and that you were attracted to. What would you say and what would you do? And what was found during his role plays that we frequently go from, hi, how are you, to, will you move in with me, in as little as 3 different exchanges. So again, he just did not appreciate that what was normal or appropriate behaviour. And again, I think another key point I want to raise here is that many people with autism will often look to films and TV to understand how to act in the social world. So they use these films and TV to generate social scripts that they then apply to the real world. And often, you get movies and things where people are like, "Hi, how are you?" And in very 5 minutes they're in bed, or they're getting married in 10 minutes time, whatever. I'm kind of exaggerating, but they think the real world is like that as well. So that it's very confusing to the person with autism when they're told that actually this is not appropriate. He also had significant difficulties with interacting with others. So again, you can understand how someone really struggles to interact with others, and what they mean, and trying to understand metaphor and irony and sarcasm, that they will often avoid that kind of in-depth communication. And I'll talk more about that later on as well. One of the last cases here is a case of a 22-year-old male with ASD who was found guilty of numerous counts of theft and criminal damage. This young guy had a particular restrictive interest in cotton lingerie. It was interesting, and I know many of you will be like, well, how can you kind of disentangle it? But his interest in cotton lingerie was not a sexual one, believe it or not. When they explored the functionality of that interest, they found that it was driven by the sensory aspect of that material. There's many cases as well in the literature of people with ASD that are really sensory attracted to satin and silk, so they might steal women's underwear that is that kind of nature as well. So this man was particularly fascinated with watching washing go round a washing machine, and he would do this for hours and hours in his local laundromat. When that local laundromat shut down, he was like, what did I do? How did I pursue this interest? And so he broke into one of his neighbour's property and would sit and watch the laundry go round and round and round, and also stole some of the kind of, or held onto and touched some of the undergarments of the neighbour as well. But in this case, it was recognised that it was related to his ASD. That was really what was creating the context of vulnerability to engage in this offending behaviour, that it wasn't indicative of an escalation in the pattern of sexual offending behaviour, that this behaviour wasn't going to escalate to a hands-on sexual offence, that it was serving a different function to this man. So we've talked about hands-on sexual offending. I'm going to now turn to perhaps a lesser explored in the literature topic, which is how autism can provide the context of vulnerability to engaging in the viewing or distribution, etc., of indecent child imagery. I use the word child pornography here. I've worked with many colleagues in Australia and the US, and that tends to be the terminology used, child pornography. But in the UK in particular, there's a real drive away from the use of child pornography. It gives the idea that the child is somewhat complicit and a willful, willing partner, if you like, in that behaviour. Like you've got adult pornography, it's like consensual, there's an element of consensus there, the person's consented. But when you've got children in pornography, they're a victim because they're underage as well, obviously. And so we prefer in the UK now to use the legal terminology of indecent child imagery or child sexual abuse imagery. So I do apologise for the lack of appropriate legal definition. So I was really interested. I said, here's what's been done in autism and sexual offending of a hands-on nature. What's been done in relation to hands-off sexual offending, in effect, and in particular this type? And I found a real dearth of research in this field. In fact, most of the work that I found were in these two books here. The book on the left, I thoroughly recommend, The Autism Spectrum, Sexuality and the Law. This book, when I first read it a couple of years ago, when I opened it up, I was very, very sceptical. Up until that point, I'd done research on autism in relation to a whole range of offending behaviours, including mass shooting, school shooting, lone act of terrorism. And despite that background, I was very much like, I don't know if I really buy this, for the want of a better expression. I was very sceptical, very reluctant to believe that there would be a vulnerability there, believe it or not. And I think it's quite normal, I suppose, that kind of reaction to this type of offending behaviour, when it is children, it is more kind of emotionally charging, if you like. It's more jarring when children are involved in a crime. However, after reading this book, I really did get a real strong insight in how certain features of autism can provide that context of vulnerability. And I would say that this is a really excellent book to get if you don't look at anything else, and you want to understand more of what I'm talking about. This is definitely the book to get, the one on the left. It's made up of 3 parts. The first part is an autobiography account of someone with autism that was diagnosed in adulthood, who was also charged with this type of behaviour, and it's Nick Dubin, pictured in the middle here. So Nick Dubin's an American, and he really wrote in great detail from childhood all the way up to the time of the offence and when he was convicted, what he was thinking, why he didn't realise that what he was doing was illegal, and I'll talk more about some of those thoughts in the next couple of slides. The second part of this book is taken from the perspective of a lawyer. So Professor Larry Dubin, who's Nick Dubin's father, wrote it from a legal perspective. And then lastly, the third part is written by Professor Tony Atwood, who's a psychologist, British born and based in Australia. And he writes about it from a clinical perspective. So it's got the personal narrative account, perspective from a lawyer, and perspective from a clinician. It's a really, really invaluable book. The book on the right is also really excellent, and it goes into a lot of legal information in more depth and also clinical information in more depth as well. So in those books and some other bits of literature I saw, identified a number of features of SD that can provide the context of vulnerability to engage in this offend behaviour. And I've listed them here, and I'm going to try and go into them as much detail but as quickly as I can in the next number of slides. So the first one is that many people with autism turn to the internet for information on sexual information, and also for sexual gratification. And there's a number of reasons for this, why the internet is the preferred conduit to the outside world for some people with ASD or autism. And that is because computer-mediated interaction or text-based speech is actually more preferable to people with ASD because it doesn't have, or to many, it doesn't have the difficulties that they would face in face-to-face interactions. So they don't have to be worried about what the person's expressions, what that means, and they don't have to worry about certain tones and what that might mean. They don't have to worry about non-verbal communication. All the things that many people with autism can often struggle with. There's no issue with understanding irony or metaphor. They've also got more time with which to try and process what they've read and respond. And they can come out of that situation whenever they want, whenever it becomes too overwhelming. So it does make sense why the internet and text-based speech can be so appealing to people with SD. And if they turn to the internet more and more, it does put them more at risk of coming across this type of material, particularly if they're using the internet in order to understand sexual relationships, etc. And what's interesting is the literature really does support that people with autism are less likely to get sexual education from their peers, their parents, as well as their teachers. So they often only have the internet in order to seek that information. There's also a term called Counterfeit Deviance. This was a term coined by Hinsberger in 1991. And what it is that what on the surface looks like deviant sexual behaviour, actually for that person with the SD serves a completely different function that is not deviant at all. So in the case I mentioned earlier about the person with the SD that was really restricted, had a restrictive interest and preoccupied interest in silk, that may look deviant in the sense that it's very sexual and it's going to be escalating into a sexual act. But in the person with the SD, the function of that behaviour is something very completely different. It's serving something else for them that's not sexual. There's also unbridled curiosity. Some people with SD, they're often unrestrained by everyday societal taboos and legal taboos and social taboos. So they don't necessarily understand, they don't have it in peers, when you're in school, you're like, oh, I really like this. And their peers are like, oh man, that's like really weird. Why are you interested in that? So they're not necessarily got that same restriction on them that neurotypicals might do. So you often do find that people with ASD or autism do have really unusual kind of far out interests. So they do tend to be interested in things like, Second World War and torture devices, or, different, illnesses and diseases, etc., and serial killers. It does tend to be quite common in this group. So again, in relation to indecent visual imagery, they can become very curious and look at things online to try and understand things. And there's been many cases I've been involved with and I've heard about whereby the person with the ASD has been really perplexed and curious about why someone might be interested in underage images. Why are they interested in these young kids? And to try and understand that, they'll go online to look at the images to see what is it about them, and where a neurotypical might realise that, oh, hold on, if I do that, that is illegal. And by simply viewing that image, what I'm doing is legal, regardless of the reasoning for you doing it. Many people also have an impaired ability to intuit or understand naturally social mores or legal rules. So again, as I mentioned, not necessarily recognising that other people might find their behaviour illegal or odd or inappropriate because they maybe haven't learned that as they've been grown up with peers, etc. So they don't necessarily have the same standard of what's wrong to others. They haven't whereas many people would be like, oh no, that's really wrong because other people won't do that, or other people think that's wrong. They don't necessarily view their behaviour in that same way. I'm going to skip this slide a little bit because I have mentioned it in detail earlier, but there's a common misconception in people with ASD that they lack empathy. So this kind of slide goes into that in more detail. So there's cognitive empathy and there's emotional empathy. So I mentioned earlier, just to kind of quickly recap, that cognitive empathy is the ability to understand and predict other people's behaviour, whereas emotional or affective empathy is the ability to resonate emotionally with other people's feelings or how they might think and feel. I think it's really important to note that this is in direct contrast to a psychopath. A psychopath would be the opposite. They would be impaired in their emotional empathy, so they choose not to feel anything for that person or their victim, but their cognitive empathy is non-impaired, and in fact it's even heightened. They may have a surfeit of skills in cognitive empathy, which is why they're so good at manipulating others and getting to do what they want, etc., because they really understand how other people will react to their behaviours and what they say. Another feature of ASD is that may provide the context of vulnerability to this type of behaviour is social maturity. Many will be familiar with the fact that many people with ASD may function cognitively at a chronological average age or even above. So they might be 27 years old and very intelligent cognitively, maybe even higher intelligence than most people of their age, but their emotional or social maturity will be much, much lower potentially. So their intellectual understanding is there, 27 years old, but that 27-year-old guy's emotional empathy or social empathy or maturity is more like a 14-year-old, for instance. And so again, you can see here someone with ASD, given kind of the features I've talked about already, not understanding that other people might think this is odd and not do it, that they may gravitate towards younger people and to interact with because they find it much easier. They talk about the same things, same interests. They're at the same level of them socially and emotionally, so they find it more comfortable. And again, because of the autism, might not recognise that actually, if people are looking at this outside, that a 27-year-old guy hanging around with a bunch of 14 or 15-year-old kids is going to look really, really weird. Again, this can often lead to inappropriate behaviour as well, sexually or otherwise, if they then start interacting with a young person in a sexual way. Literal thinking in people with ASD is another feature it's important to consider. Sometimes this is called inflexibility of thought or cognitive rigidity. So it's this idea that the person is not able to kind of think in it's very black and white thinking. They can't think that, oh, I think this, or this is definitely illegal. And then, so I'll give an example. So if they come across something online that of this nature, they might think, oh, how could something that's so freely available online possibly be illegal? It's very black and white thinking. Oh well, I saw a similar image on someone else's computer, or in a store, or in a TV show. How can this be illegal? It's very very rigid, and they often have difficulty with looking at the grey in between of things. As I mentioned, there's also impaired theory of mind. So not being able to understand when they look at these images or videos of young children, where and how those files came to be, and who else might have access to those files, and indeed what are the consequences on the minors in the images or videos they're actually looking at. They don't necessarily realise that, hold on here, that child is a victim, and they may be feeling really distressed, etc. Another really interesting thing is people with ASD have often been found to have an impaired ability to correctly estimate or guess age, in this particular certain brackets. So they might struggle to recognise that someone's actually 16 versus 20 or 30, or someone's 30 versus 20 or 45. There's been no empirical studies to support this, but anecdotally, it's been a well-recognised phenomenon in people with ASD that there is that real kind of more difficulty there. And again, if they're viewing images online, they might actually not immediately recognise that actually it's an underage image that they're actually looking at. Relating to this is, and exacerbating that issue of being impaired in ability to recognise or estimate age appropriately, is the fact that in media, so the social media world, etc., and pop culture, we're bombarded with images of young children made to look older, or older people made to look younger. So it's really blurring the distinction intentionally of what is illegal and what is not illegal. The image here to the right is from a French magazine, mainstream magazine. It wasn't like a weird sexual thing, but mainstream magazine, and it was very, very controversial. It depicted on the front cover a French model who was only 10 years of age when this picture was taken, sorry. And again, you can see here, she's made out to be much older than her years. And in many people with autism and learning disabilities, etc., can really, really struggle to actually recognise that is indeed a young person there. And I think we're fraught with media that is of this nature. It's really blurring that distinction, making it further difficult for people to recognise that what they're looking at is actually illegal, and is even indeed appropriate. As someone with autism is faced with images like the one here, another example of the same 10-year-old model, that, well, if I saw that there, and if I'm looking at it on my computer at home, why is that any different? How could that then be illegal? They can really struggle with that. People with autism, and this applies to all types of behaviour as well, they struggle to understand and recognise facial expression, or they can be impaired in their ability to do this. And this is particularly the case with facial expressions that are negative, so like distressful or fearful, upset faces. And again, if you're a person with autism and you're looking at these images of young children, and they're maybe distressed or crying in the images, they might not pick up on that and recognise that actually, hold on here, this is weird, and as a victim here, this child is unhappy and is not a willing participant. So I've talked now about how certain features of autism can provide the context of vulnerability to engaging in a range of offend behaviours. And what I want to cover in the next 10 minutes or so is, not only should we look at when a defendant with ASD is charged with an offence, how their features may provide the context of vulnerability to their offend behaviour, to make sure they're given a fair hearing. It's explored as whether it's a mitigating factor, etc. But also how that person's autism may be misperceived and how they may present in court. They may actually look really negative and go against them. So I'm going to give you an example. It's a hypothetical example of a male defendant with ASD who has been prosecuted for assault and battery. So when this defendant with autism was on the stand, he appeared very nervous, no eye contact with anyone that was questioning him, the prosecution, the judge, no eye contact with the victim, the alleged victim, and he would be fidgeting, etc. He also exhibited no emotional expression, such as shock, when he was shown pictures of the potential alleged victim's injuries following his alleged assault and battery. He exhibited no signs of emotion, of remorse, or he didn't say he was sorry for his actions. And because of this behaviour, he was immediately disliked by the juries, and the judge. He pled guilty, but this defendant's attorney pleaded for leniency for him during the sentencing hearing, saying that he did not understand that what he did was wrong, and legally, that actually at the time that what he's doing was wrong. And when he was asked by the judge, were his actions wrong, he just shrugged in response. So because of this behaviour, the judge gave this young man a maximum sentence because he believed that he was taking no responsibilities for his offending behaviour. But indeed, there's cases of people with ASD who may present in this way, but it's not indicative at all or reflective of what they actually think and feel inside. So in many people with autism, they can actually exhibit no emotional expression, but actually inside they're feeling really stressed and anxious and really sorry for what they've done, but they don't communicate it in the same way that a neurotypical would. Also, some features of autism can make that person look really guilty, but again, it's related to their autism rather than any elements of guilt. So they might not have eye contact because it's too much and too overwhelming for them to have eye contact within that very stressful environment of the courtroom, or they may engage in fidgeting or hand flapping because it's a self-stimulative behaviour. So rather than being, evidence of being guilty and, oh no, am I going to get out here? It's actually evidence of something else related to autism. And these are just some examples. There's also elements about autism that I won't go into that also can make the person look really guilty unless it's explained to you. One very quickly is that they may take longer to respond to certain questions or questions overall. And this isn't because they're thinking and fabricating a response because they're making it up. Rather, some people also can take longer to process the question and to respond. And this is often called Asperger time. So they take longer, and it's not because of intellectual impairment or difficulty. It's relating to the ability they take longer to process and what they've heard and kind of come up with a response. But it's not because they're trying to fabricate something. So this hypothetical example that I've just mentioned raises two key questions that I've hopefully explored in some detail today. And that's, should the jury have been told about the man's ASD and how it affected his presentation during the courtroom so that they're able to more accurately assess his testimony? And two, should they be told about how his ASD and certain features may have been a valid mitigating factor in relation to his offending behaviour and subsequent sentencing decision? So I would argue, hopefully this presentation has given some indication about the fact that I think it's so important that both of these things are explored in any defendant with ASD that's charged. And I think that it should be treated on a case-by-case basis. So not a widespread, general application of this, but it's looked at on a case-by-case basis. Because autism should not automatically be a get-out-of-jail-free card. And rather than getting out of jail, it should also highlight the need for more appropriate outcomes, such as diversionary measures or liaison diversion measures. So, like, particularly for low statute offences, rather than imprisoning them, they're given psychoeducation to learn about what they've done wrong, to learn about what's appropriate, and just learn about how to interact with others in a more socially appropriate way. When you are attracted to someone, how do you go about that in a way that's more appropriate, rather than, like one of the cases we talked about earlier, going from "Hi, how are you?" to "Will you go to bed with me?" in 3 interactions. So these are just some of the features of ASD that may make a defendant with ASD appear evasive, remorseless, and lacking in empathy. I've spoken about some of these, but these are some, and as I say, I'm really, really happy to talk about in more detail afterwards, or sharing the material that goes to these, speaks to these in more detail. I often want to argue as well, also want to argue that in some cases of the SD, they may not meet the legal definition of being criminal responsible for their behaviour. So in the law, there's two kind of core strands to meet the definition of being criminal responsible. This is actus rea. So this is the person knew that what they're doing was a criminal act. So they carried out the guilty act. And two is the criminal intent, the mens rea, that they knew that what they were doing was going to cause harm to others. So in many people's laws, when they do meet the first strand there, the actus rea, that what they did was, did they carry out the criminal offending behaviour? Yes. But they can be impaired in the ability to recognise the intent and the harm that they caused on their victims. So therefore, should they be considered criminally responsible for their behaviour? And there's a lot of really interesting debate about this in the literature. And I've given some examples in the slide here. So thank you very much for listening. I know it was a very whistle-stop tour of this very complex topic, but hopefully it's given you some kind of insight and, places where you know to go to kind of seek more information. And I do encourage you to get in touch with me, email me, follow me on Twitter or follow me in ResearchGate. And I cannot recommend more my book if this is a topic that you find of interest and want to learn more about. My book really does synthesize a real great amount of literature all into the one kind of resource, so it can be a real go-to guide to this topic. So thank you, everybody. Hopefully you can still hear me and I didn't go dead halfway through, but thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Claire. It's been really fascinating. I still wanted to hear more, actually. I was like, okay, keep going. It's great. This is really fascinating. I think, Agustín is. Yes, it was really interesting to hear you, and I have to say that your perspective is, the approach is obviously very scientific, very objective in the way that we maybe we should understand these kind of disorders, but at the same time, I believe that there's always like a very kind of human view on the way that you are trying to identify the controversies, the problems that can appear in these kind of processes, because of course there are very, very, because when I was listening to you, I was wondering about how you feel when you are, because in some way you are giving a verdict in a way, about the condition of a person, and in a way you are not deciding, but what you say has an impact on their lives. So that must be a very, very difficult to deal with, and I'm sure that with the time you have become more clear about what you are doing. But I think that I would like to say that from a general perspective of what you have presented, I have the first question that comes to me is, if we have to question the normality of social normativity, of course, we have an idea of what's normal. We have a normative structure in social matters, moral matters, legal matters, and all that. But when I was listening to the first part about the spectrum and all these conditions that can be mixed, like all these traits that can be mixed, and even if they're mixed, they have different intensity spectrum. So it sounds like very, very difficult, but at the same time, I was wondering if what we need to do is to change our social parameters in order to be to start thinking really in an inclusive way, because we talk a lot about being inclusive and all this, but when you have such a complex understanding or a complex phenomenon to understand, I think those parameters cannot be easily established.
Yeah, I have to say, I think you do raise a really, really interesting point. I would first state that relatively there's very little research being done looking at autism in relation to offend behaviour. I think it's not because it's not important to look at and it's not a real thing. Rather, I think a lot of people are really scared to explore it. There's a lot of negativity around mentioning these two things in the one sentence because a lot of people view it as being stigmatizing to the wider sample of people with autism. But I think yeah, it's not good that we're talking about autism and offending. It's not good. But what I want to stress is that we're only talking about a small subset of people with autism, not people with autism more generally, and that currently we think nothing of talking about ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which are neurodevelopmental disorder that has a profile of both strengths and weaknesses as well. We think nothing about bringing that in the courtroom as a potential mitigating factor or how it was involved in the defendant behaviour, etc. We think nothing about psychosis and schizophrenia. And so my argument would be, why is any autism any different to any of these other disorders or conditions? Why should that not also be looked at in relation to the defendant's behaviour, demeanour, and offend behaviour? In the same way that all other disorders are, literally all other disorders, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. And so that's my key argument, is that why should people with autism be, when they are charged with offence, not entitled to a fair hearing? And I get a lot of resistance to that. A lot of people really say, Claire, what you're doing is terrible. But there are, when you see and come across cases that I do, where you can really clearly see the autism has played a role, that, my God, if this autism wasn't taken into consideration, the negative outcome for this individual would have been terrible. It's not prison sentence here. I'm talking about the fact that they would have gone into prison and come out and did the same offence without recognising that what they've done is wrong. Because it's not that they know they're causing harm. They don't realise that what they're doing is illegal, and they just repeat it again. So I think I'll give you a couple of examples. There's been a number of cases in the UK in particular where there's been young men, adolescent boys, etc., that have got autism, have been charged with terroristic behaviours, and they've been found with like IEDs, improvised explosive devices. But thankfully, in some of those cases, it's recognised that the autism was playing a role there, that they were collecting these IEDs because they were preoccupied with the making of them and the different chemicals and components, and the smells of the things as well. And so they were collecting them all, and the compulsive need to collect everything. And that which was driving the behaviour, rather than actually for doing it for any operational end. So they weren't doing it to use them for maliciously. They were actually doing it and collecting it because they found it fascinating. It just so happened to be something that is not a good thing to have a particular restrictive interest in. And there has been such examples in our legal system in the UK and beyond where that was recognised. Also, I think it's really important to recognise how autism might make someone look more risky when they actually may not be. And a good example of this is in indecent child imagery. So in the UK and the US in particular, when a person is charged with indecent child imagery, the more images they have on their device, the more risky they are seen to be using risk assessments. And if you don't consider autism and how the autism may have been the compulsive aspect to it, the need to collect them all, you often get people with autism that have been charged with an offence that have got thousands of images, all neatly categorised into different aspects. And their autism is what's driven at the amount of it and the categorisation, rather than it being indicative of being more interested and being more risky. And unless that's kind of autism has been factored in there, they are considered more risky and given and people with autism are given often more harsher sentences, or sentences when other people necessarily wouldn't, because of these types of things. So I think it's really important to look at autism, I think, and by the way, some excellent work done in relation to how certain features of autism may provide the context of vulnerability to engaging in terroristic behaviours is being done by Dr. Zainab Al-Attar. I really, really recommend her writing on this. I put her name in the chat. I really thoroughly recommend it. Some of the things she talks about is how autism how different, and I know it's controversial, but this is only some people with autism, how extremist groups online can be very appealing to some people with ASD because they kind of brand themselves as being very systematic and structured, and that can be very appealing to someone with autism who finds the world very socially chaotic and morally chaotic. This group's providing them with a structure to understand the world, and they're reaching out to them, and they may be getting social, kind of social interaction with others that they might not otherwise have had, or feel connected with a group, and that provides them such social significance that they again might never experience before, and they might not recognise the wider consequences of that, of engaging in that group, and the meaning and underlying behaviour of that group because of those features that are so attractive to them. But I think Sam Baltar writes about this really well as well, and I've written about this in my own book. It's really important to look at. And I think it's important to understand how certain features of autism can provide the concept of vulnerability, not just to provide a fair hearing, but also to understand how those behaviours may become entwined for prevention and also for intervention. So there's appropriate intervention put in place about, that current intervention programs for sexual offending behaviours for neurotypicals might not be appropriate for sexual offenders with autism, for example. So it's really important to do this kind of research for fair hearing, prevention, and appropriate intervention. So like the whole gambit of why this is important to look at.
Thank you. Very. I think Agustín has another question.
Well, first of all, just like Claudia said, thanks for your amazing presentation. It was really, really interesting. And I think for the people who have been watching us for the whole week is a great way of closing this series of seminars, because all the actual examples that we can see that involve all that we have been discussing about genetics and the bodies and the models, and how do we understand these connections with the environment and the society. And I wanted to ask you, although we already have a comment from the audience that I will read in a moment, I wanted to ask you, a disability obviously has to do with the person's body, with the individual, but also has to do with the society. I mean, if a society is trained or has spaces or situations where, for example, if a deaf person is involved in a big circle of people who know sign language, this person can be much more involved within the society. Mm-hmm. How does a society can be, and as Claudia pointed out, more inclusive, or can have better spaces for people with autism or neurodivergence?
I think that's a really good point. I'm going to probably answer it in a more forensic way, but I think there's something called the double empathy problem. And again, this speaks to exactly what you're mentioning there about the fact that it's not just people with autism having impairments and difficulties interacting with neurotypicals, it's also the other way around. Neurotypicals need to learn how to understand and work with people with autism. It's like interaction is not a one-way street. And so I'm not really saying it very well, but Damien Milton writes an excellent paper on this point about the double empathy problem. I'll put it into the chat. About it should work both ways. It's not people with autism should fit into society. Society should also be inclusive to them as well. So I will say that's a really important point. I don't think I spelled empathy right. It's very embarrassing as a first English speaker. You can all have a good laugh. I think for me, society is really important to look at here as well. Just from a forensic point of view, police officers, for instance, understanding how someone with autism might act very differently when they're apprehended on the street or there's interactions in the street. So you might be familiar with the fact there's been a lot of debate about, and there's been a terrible number of cases in the US where autistic guys usually have been seen as being very aggressive or threatening by police, and the police have taken very extreme actions, tasers, etc. And so I think there needs to be definitely more training around understanding how certain people with autism can present and when to not do certain things. Like a young guy with autism in the street, and the police officer comes up and touches them and manhandles them, so to speak, because of their sensory sensitivity and not liking being touched, they could act very explosively, and that's really, and if they're already really stressed, that can be, the last straw, and it's like absolutely overwhelming. They'll might lash out without understanding what they're doing and the implications, and then becomes it escalates from there, the interactions with the police. So I think there does need to be more training for police and criminal justice professionals about how to recognise someone with autism potentially, how to interact with them in a way that's effective for that person with autism as well. So there's been really, if you're interested, there's some really good guidance on how to question someone with autism and how to question other people that are vulnerable in the police context and in the court context. And in UK, we have an excellent set of toolkits that are freely available. I'll put them in the chat. It's called the Advocates Gateway in the UK, and it's a number of toolkits, and just not using tag questions, not using legal questions, you're giving appropriate time for people with autism, avoiding compound questions, multi-layer questions, etc. But a whole number of other things as well that it tells you what to avoid in people with vulnerabilities and ASD. I also want to mention as well that I think many people with autism, in particular ones that engage in extreme acts of violence, like mass shooting and school shooting or terroristic behaviours, you often see that it's not the autism, the features of autism that have driven the behaviour right away, like kind of examples I've given about how it intersects. Rather, you often see that the person with autism, in many mass shooters, they also have anxiety and depression and potential psychosis, but they also have social isolation. They've been social isolated for months or even years leading up to the attack. And it's that social isolation from wider society that I think is probably one of the critical features and that really lead to a lot of the offend behaviour. Obviously not in isolation, but it's that social isolation I think is so, so critical. When you look at a lot of the mass shooters, Adam Lanza, Dylan Roof, Elliot Rodger, a number of the cases more recently, you see that social isolation. And it's during that social isolation, their emotional, mental health, their behaviours worsen over time, and they become increasingly disconnected from reality. And I think that's what's I think most concerning. It's not necessarily it's not anxiety or depression or ASD that's caused the offence. It's the secondary outcomes as a result of those features, or disorders or conditions not being treated, and the person becoming increasingly removed from society. They're leaving school, no friends, no job, no employment, no family, and it's almost like a recipe for disaster. That even if it doesn't lead to a negative outcome like a mass shooting or a school shooting, it's still leading to a poor outcome for that individual. I think there needs to be far more recognition about those individuals that are essentially marginalised, left out of society. Nobody's picking up on the fact that they are social isolated. They've left school, so the school don't have any control over the situation, if you like, or be able to identify them. And I think that's why we see a lot of these mass shooters carry out their attacks at the particular age that we do, at that kind of transitional stage of after school, and then they don't have jobs. I've seen other peers their age, getting married, having kids, having jobs, and they're not doing the same thing, so they become increasingly withdrawn. And I think that's the concerning thing for me. I kind of prattled on there. I didn't expect to go down that route, but for me, the social isolation from society is such a critical thing.
Yes, thank you very much. We have a comment from Eliezer Eduardo. that is it says excellent presentation. You're showing us important themes that are not so well visualized or exposed within society. Muchas gracias, Eliezer.
Thank you for that. I'll give another example as well of, I really appreciate that, by the way, because you don't see anybody, so you're not quite sure what's going down, but and I'm conscious of my fast speech. Just on that point I mentioned earlier about the social isolation, I'll give you an example as well that I think really, really encapsulates this point. Do you recall that Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook elementary school shooter in 2012? His was a fascinating case. His pathway to intent violence was over many years. And in particular, looking at his social isolation component, he left school, he was homeschooled for a number of years, he had no job, eventually no friends. And when he was living in the house with his mum, he would even only interact with his mum through emails. So he was, the months leading up to the attack, he wouldn't even communicate with his own mum that he was living with face to face. And I think that just serves to, highlight this real disconnect from reality, and that's a really, really concerning factor, a risk factor, I think, in these cases, if the person's socially isolated. I think, he broke off ties with other relatives and other family members, his dad, his brother, in the years leading up to the attack as well. I think it's an important point.
Yeah, and I would like to point something out about what you say about social isolation, that what I really, really like about your perspective is the twist that you make, like thinking about responsibility, and instead of that, thinking of vulnerability, because if you think in terms of responsibility in a offender or defendant, what you are looking, what the system is looking is reasons to put him or put her into jail and punish her and punish him, and like the punitive, the punishment is the purpose or the target at the end. But if we think in terms of vulnerability, we can also use, I would say that perspective would be very, very useful, not only for people with some kind of disorder, but what we kind of briefly talked before we start the talk today, about social circumstances of extreme violence. If you're living in an extreme violent atmosphere, you're vulnerable. So your responsibility is very difficult to establish how responsible you can become in a context when you have been isolated, receiving aggressions, marginalized, and this how do you say, discriminado, excluded,
Yes.
and discriminado. I'm sure you understand what I'm saying. So in that way, I think this is a very, very important idea that we should think not only in terms of the relationship between psychiatric conditions or psychological conditions and law and the criminal justice system, but also in terms of there are some other conditions that population that people are living in that make them completely vulnerable. And a disorder like this, of course, is one very important. Of course, is obviously something that we should have in mind. But also this idea of changing. I think this is very, very. I really like that, and I'm sure it's going to help. Personally, it's going to help me a lot to try to understand all these conditions, all the streets.
Thank you, Claudia. I think I I'd like to add to some of the good points he made there as well. I do agree. I have focused on, in presentations largely intersectionality between psychology and the law. But yeah, I agree with you. I think the offend behaviour is a combination of everything: genetics, biology, environment, psychology. And I think for me, one of my favourite books that I really recommend the audience to read if you want is a book by Adrian Raine, The Anatomy of Violence. I'll put it into the chat. Adrian Raine with an E at the end. It's called The Anatomy of Violence. This book is fabulous because I think it really is almost like probably the book of the conference, I think, for you, maybe. And that he explores, for me, he's probably one of the few researchers that has explored the brains of murderers and offenders in the detail that he has. He's almost unparalleled as far as I'm concerned. He's done a lot of studies looking at the brain scans of violent offenders and homicide offenders and what abnormalities they have, reduced brain areas that might contribute to the offend behaviour or different levels of activation in the brain. He's also looked at lead poisoning and other kind of chemicals that can link to violent offend behaviour. It looks at genetics, psychology factors and everything. So that book really shows and emphasises just that any offend behaviour, it's a combination of a variety of different factors. No one factor in and of itself is sufficient. I thoroughly recommend that to readers. And I really say that it's written by an academic. It's a very readable book. So if you're sitting in the audience and you're not maybe from a psychological background or psychiatry background or neurobiological, this book is still very readable. He's got a remarkable ability to communicate complex ideas in a very communicative way, and very readable. You almost don't realise you're reading, the findings from academic work. Is so well done. It is more like a novel. It's very excellent. So yeah, I agree. I think it is important to look at all the different factors involved. And I think for me, my research has definitely gone down more that path, Claudia, where I have looked at, as you say, the law really much like what happened at the time of the offence and the lead up to the offence, but it's so much important to look at everything from childhood practically, what trauma that may have altered brain structure and impact on their cognitions and behaviours subsequently. And a lot of my research does look at the whole lifetime of extreme violent offenders, not just the months or days leading up to the attack. I've become increasingly more interested in threat assessment as well. So looking at how different warning behaviours or different patterns of behaviour change dynamically over time as well in the months or years leading up to the attack. I've become really entrenched with, to use a better expression, with something called the TRAP 18. The TRAP 18 is a threat assessment tool, and it stands for Terrorist Radicalisation Assessment Protocol. And it's a sort of threat assessment that consists of 18 different warning behaviours that they ask assessors to kind of look out for. 8 of them are very proximal warning behaviours, so they're the warning behaviours that occur more closely in time with the actual attack of concern. And then there's 10 distal warning behaviours that tend to occur more distally, in the year or months leading up to the attack rather than really closer to the actual attack itself. And I think this is really interesting way of identifying risk in people, who may be more at risk. It doesn't tell you like, yeah, this person's going to carry out an attack. It's not a tool that says, yeah, this is a definite cert. It's more helping to identify, triage persons of concern. This person's exhibiting more proximal warning behaviour, so that we need to look at that person more closely and put more resources in there. This person's exhibiting a number of distal factors but no proximal. Therefore, we'll just put in this level of kind of detection, kind of resources now, rather than more in-depth resources that you would if someone was exhibiting even one proximal behaviour. So I really recommend the audience, if they're interested in this, really look into the TRAP 18, because I think it's far better than risk assessment in many cases, because it looks at behaviour dynamically over time. It looks at what is the pattern of change over, the months up to attack or the week before the attack, what change did the person exhibit in their warning behaviours. It also looks at, unlike risk assessment, not just did they have schizophrenia, for instance, but tick box risk. Rather it looks at it more dynamically, like okay, that person has schizophrenia, but having schizophrenia doesn't mean you're going to carry out an act of violence. Rather, explore with that person. Do you have any delusions or hallucinations or auditory delusions? What are they? What's the content of them? Are they violent in content? And if so, what does that make you feel when you think about those violent auditory hallucinations or visual hallucinations? Are you repulsed by it when you see that violent stuff, or do you find it actually quite gratifying? So it really goes into it in much more detail and dynamically and over time as well, which I think is a real strength of threat assessment over risk assessment. If I'm honest, I think they're actually they complement each other and they should be done in tandem to some degree. I don't know if it goes really off topic.
No, I think it's really. I'm really. I think this is great what you just presented, this Trap 18 thing, because one of the things that we have been talking during the week is about the impact of data in making decisions when it comes to the justice system. And risk assessment can be very biased, because data, how you build the data, how you deal with it, how you choose which data is going to be part of your system and all of that. And I would recover something that you said almost at the end of your talk, that this idea of seeing case by case, like the case by case basis.
Yes.
And I think that's very important. And what you just said about the Trap 18, it seems to me that it goes into that direction, like just reinforcing this idea that there's no way that you can have just one protocol that would be fair to absolutely every case. So you have to see case by case. And to me, that's the problem sometimes with risk assessment, especially if you don't have a good system to deal with data,
Yes. I've actually written a paper with a colleague in the US, Dr. Alexander Westphal, who's based at Yale University. He's also a psychiatrist. And we wrote a paper where we talked about the limitations of risk assessments, standardized risk assessments for people with autism. So from my own experience, I feel like risk assessments there's a lot of limitations for this group. And there's also some great work being done by Dr. David Murphy on this as well, where we have this thing called the HCR20. It's quite a commonly used risk assessment tool for violence, predicting violence, I feel like. And it's really largely been shown to be, to use the one very expression, awful for people with ASD. It can make them look more risky than they actually are, often. So yeah, I think there is real limitations with current standardized risk assessments. I do agree, in relation to autism in particular.
Yes, thank you, Claire. Agustín, I don't know if you have other question or the audience.
Actually going to ask about this thing that you already discussed with Trap 18, which is awesome, but it made me think about another part of your presentation. I don't recall the concepts precisely, but you thought about the guilty body versus the guilty mind. And it made me think about reinsertion and desistance. I mean, if there's a conviction and a crime and a felony and a conviction afterwards, and the sentence is completed, what's the work with these persons as for the future? Do they get their body reinserted into society, or do they think about their minds and how to, maybe if not gain a complete awareness of their society, at least the desistance of crime?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm trying to think of a good example. For for me, I've always, I don't know if this, hopefully this does relate to your question, Agustín, I hope so. But I think for me, I've always said that in schools in the UK and the US in particular, and elsewhere really, I think this is without exception really, that we don't teach in our schools about how to engage in social interactions with others, what's appropriate, when to back off. What, if you find someone attractive, how do you go about that in an appropriate way? And how do you recognize actually that you've overstepped the mark, or when that person is really not interested? I think sexual education is more focused around the logistics, STIs, how to engage in safe behaviors, and it's more, there's less of a focus on social skills and romantic skill training, which I think would not be just useful for people with autism, but for a lot of other groups and many children. So I'm not necessarily singling out people with autism here. I think such education can go such a long, long way to reducing the vulnerability of many people with autism that engage in offend behaviour to their offend behaviour. A good example would be, when I speak to forensic psychiatrists and lawyers, they say, Clare, we're inundated with young men, in their 20s, etc., that have been charged with sexual offending behaviour that have autism. And they said they've done it without realising that what they did was wrong at all, no comprehension at all. And it's because they haven't had that training to recognise that what they've done is socially inappropriate. So I'll give you an example, and relating to all the features I've talked about already as well. You have a 27-year-old guy in a subway, and he's got autism, and he's got a lot of the features I've already kind of covered today. And he sees across from a young woman, and he's attracted to her, and he smells at her, and she smells back, because society does kind of have this thing where you do smell at someone who smells at you, and they interact with you and ask how the weather is, you'll respond in kind, usually. So when he's interacting with her, with all the kind of features I've mentioned already, the vulnerability factors, he's like, oh, this lady, she's talking to me, she really likes me, and I'm really attracted to her as well. And he's not recognising actually that she's getting increasingly more uncomfortable, and he might then leave the train with her, following her, still interacting with her, and she's just still trying to interact with him to keep him appeased, if you like, because it's polite. And then before you know it, he's maybe touching her on the shoulder or the hip or the bum, whatever, and it's considered a sexual contact offence. And he's generally done it because he thought that woman was attracted to him, that it was the right, normal thing to do, it was appropriate. And I think, as I say, forensic psychiatrists say, Claire, we've got so many of these different cases. So in cases like that, could it have been if that person was given appropriate training in childhood or adolescence about to know that that was inappropriate, and what questions to maybe ask to be able to determine whether that person is receiving your attentions in a good way? That, they could, if they do struggle to recognise emotional expressions and recognise fear and disgust or unhappiness, what could they ask to kind of, to ask, are you okay with what I'm doing? I've got autism, or, let me know if this is inappropriate, because they wouldn't necessarily think to do that if they hadn't been told that their behaviour might be seen as being inappropriate in certain contexts. So I think for me, it's emotional awareness development, social skills training. I think is so critical here, and I think many people also that do offend, they haven't had that training that they might either get from other areas like peers, etc., because their friends are superficial, or don't go into very much depth. So I always give this example of a bunch of young boys in school, and they're 14-year-old, and they're kind of experimenting with things, and they're talking to each other about relationships and who they're attracted to. And one of them might go, I'm really attracted to Susan over there, and they'll all talk to each other about, what will you say to her, and how will you ask her out, and how will you know, so there's a lot of learning goes on there in school, not just with, no sexual education training that I think is appropriate to the extent it should be, but they're not even getting, some people also, that level of training as well from peers, even in relation to what's appropriate. So young boys in school, again, 14-year-old, one of them says to their friends, I'm really interested in this sexual practice. And for you and I, we might go, oh my God, that's like so inappropriate and so abnormal. And his friends will go, oh, that's weird, you know, and they kind of tailor their interests, sexual interests as they're developing over time. Another thing I forgot to mention earlier as well is that in people with autism, they can be very fixated at certain things and not develop over time. So if you have like a 14-year-old guy, or let's call it a 12-year-old guy with a 12-year-old young boy with autism, and with peers, they're sharing pictures of other similar aged girls. So 12 pictures of 12 and 14-year-old girls, for instance, which at that point in time is not necessarily odd or inappropriate. But as that young boy with autism is developing over time, he's still keeping those same pictures, and they're still serving the same sexual interest for him. And he's not developing emotionally from that. He's not recognising, hold on here, that's now inappropriate now. I need to move on, develop to other images that his chronological age peers are actually then gravitating towards. You often see that in people with autism, they will stick to the same thing. It's not, and then how when they're 18 and still looking at the same images that they did when they were 12, that's actually inappropriate. They don't recognise that as such because it's what they've always done, and they don't recognise it as being inappropriate in any way. And they need to then look at other types of more developmentally appropriate images.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
I don't know if we have another comment or question from the audience, Agustín.
No, right now, but si alguien tiene comentarios que quieran o preguntas que quieren hacer en español, pueden hacerlo directamente si las traducimos a Clare. But I don't know if you, Claudia, have anything else?
Yeah, well, I think I think we should maybe we should start closing, you know, like kind of closing. Well, thinking of maybe just a few ideas, or I would like to ask you about how has the relationship with the justice system personally been, you know, like how did you personally from what you study, from your ethical positions, your ethical position, how do you deal with the justice system? Because maybe if we compare a justice system between countries, we can see that one is kind of better, or one is better in this, or worse in that, and this kind of thing. But in general, the justice system everywhere is close. You know, it tries to. They are always like, obviously, they are normative. They are very. The word is the rule, basically, you know. So how do you deal with all these complex conditions, situations, findings with the UK justice system?
It's an interesting point. I hope I answer your question, but what I've found is that there are small pockets of good practice, but they're few and far between. So I found even with defense lawyers, some of them are like, yeah, autism, I get it, you know, I'm keeping, I recognize that could be a potential mitigating factor. So they will seek an expert psychiatric report or psychological report, whereas other defense teams do not see the relevance at all. They think it's completely immaterial to the defense. So they don't seek an expert psychiatric report. And that's really unusual for me. I was first really struck by how odd that was. Surely as a defence team, you want to try and get as much straws, if you like, as possible, you know, to give your client the best defence, you know, the most fair hearing as possible. But I found that not to be the case. And as I mentioned already, small pockets of good practice, few and far between. And often it's down to a judge that happens to be aware of this particular things I'm talking about, or maybe has a family member, so has a kind of more in-depth and appreciation, understanding, and so they're more open to, you know, taken into consideration during sentencing, etc. But there's no consistency, as you say, Claudia. There's no, the autism's it's been clearly argued by defence expert witnesses that there's definitely a link there with this individual. So I'm going to take into consideration. Sometimes it's not, sometimes it is, sometimes it's somewhere in between. And so I think for me that was a big surprise. And also I think there's in the UK, I think there's the Advocates Gateway have really helped with making sure that people with autism and other vulnerabilities or vulnerable conditions are given appropriate court adaptations, so they're able to participate more effectively in their own trial as well. So they're maybe given, screened from the courtroom, so only the judge and the jury can see them. Removal of wigs. They may be able to see the questions beforehand, so they can kind of go in and know what to expect to some degree. Get a tour around the courtroom, so it's not such a novel, stressful environment for them. So there is some good practice, but as I say, very variable. And I think I can understand why currently right now there is such variability, because as I mentioned already, there's not a huge amount of literature, compared to other areas, like other academic areas. It's still a relatively new emerging field. And I think that a lot of people are really hesitant and skeptical of it because it is new relatively. And I also think that another issue is people view it as a get out of jail free card, an excuse, if you like. So there's a lot of, no, I'm not buying this, especially if the diagnosis is made post-offence or post-conviction, which is often the case where the person's only recognised as being vulnerable after they've carried out an offence, which again is then seen as being fabricated and just an excuse to get them out of jail, for instance, whatever. Another thing I was going to make, I've forgotten what it was now. It was probably my critical point, but it'll come back to me. Hopefully I've got time for it to come back to me.
Yes.
I encourage questions from people to get in touch with me, absolutely.
Yes, we have one question to close it all out from the audience, which luckily is already in English, so you can read that.
Yes.
It was by Gore Castillo. Thank you very much. It was an interesting presentation. I have a few questions. How about women with autism? What would be an appropriate sanction for a person with ASD? And what would happen if the individual with autism knew about the consequences of the act that had made, knowing that it's on a spectrum?
Yeah, very good questions there, Gori. For the first one, there's been some interesting research that has found that people with autism, females with autism, are less likely to be diagnosed or misdiagnosed. That the prevalence currently is like 4 males diagnosed for every 1 female. And this gives us the idea that it's somehow a male predominant disorder. But there's increasing recognition in the literature that actually autism expresses differently in females. And so it's not getting picked up and not being recognised. And also, in a lot of screening tools and for autism and diagnostic tools are based on what is actually a male presentation of autism. So there's been some studies showing that females are better. Sorry if this isn't too much detail, but it's a really interesting question. There's been interesting research showing that females largely overall are much more effective at masking or camouflaging their autistic impairments, particularly the ones that are in relation to social impairments of communication. It's been found that people that are females with autism, they're really, really great overall. I'm speaking very broadly here, but they're really excellent at going into a social setting and identifying the person that's most socially skilled and watching them, and then not in any weird way, but watching them and then imitating them perfectly, down to their facial expressions and body language. And they come across really, really socially skilled, but in actual fact, it is to some degree superficial, and that when things get too complex, they very quickly become socially out their depth and the situation becomes very overwhelming for them. But they do have ability to mask. So often you find that many females with autism are misdiagnosed or not diagnosed. And, people at work, when they find out that some of their female colleagues with autism are actually autistic, they're like, God, you wouldn't know. And often it can take a real emotional toll. So that the female with autism might be a teacher, and nobody would know anything, be none the wiser that they had difficulties with social interactions, etc. But that woman may go home and is socially exhausted, has to lie down for an hour or more to recover from that social exertion of the day. And this links to another point that people with autism, I would say, they don't hate people, they don't hate social interactions with others, so they don't turn to the internet or avoid social interactions largely because of hating of people. They actually really like people and want to interact with them, but may find it so overwhelming, so anxiety provoking that they revert to not pursuing it. There's also often an idea people with autism are very antisocial individuals and hate people. This is largely not the case, and it can, in fact, completely the opposite. And in females with autism, it can be very highly sensitive to other people's feelings and emotions to the point where it's overwhelming. So hopefully that answers. So I think a lot of women, and in the criminal justice system, I'd say that a lot of women are not recognised and diagnosed properly, but also males with autism are often misdiagnosed with antisocial personality disorder in the forensic context as well, which I think is a real challenge. I think in some cases with people with ASD, particularly for low-level offences, if you want a better word, low statute offences, that in many cases prison is not the best place for them. Psychoeducation or other diversionary measures would be far more appropriate. I've talked a lot about research about the impact of the prison environment for someone with autism. It can be far more challenging and debilitating and damaging. The not recognising the prisoner talk, that there's gangs and what's appropriate and what's correct to say, and they can very quickly get themselves into serious issues with other prisoners, with other inmates. And there's also the sensory aspect, the noise, the slamming of doors, all the shouting by other inmates can be really, really overwhelming for someone with autism. And unlike neurotypicals, they don't habituate to that over time. It isn't just as disturbing when they first heard it as it is months later. So yeah, I think it's a good point. And I think your last point it is quite a challenge. And how do you is there any, a lot of the work I've talked about today talks about how when you have a diagnosis from someone that's got autism, you see what areas they're particularly more impaired on, and you're kind of mapping that on to the offending behaviour and how that may have played a role. But it's not objective. It's not absolutely definitive. So you are kind of saying this would indicate, this suggests. There's no clear cut, and I think that's something that I always think is very challenging as well, because there will be some people with autism that the features may have played a role in their offending behaviour to a certain extent, but they weren't so impaired for them to know that what they're doing was wrong. And it's how do you distinguish between those different types of people with autism? And that is a difficulty. I think we do need to kind of have more risk assessments and more tools out there to be able to help guide clinicians on those particular points. So it's not purely down to clinical subjective opinion.
Thank you very much, Claire. And I'll just welcome Maria Elena for closing out this session. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you.
To hear you. Now we have a lot of questions.
Yes, not for now. Yeah, well, but yes, I think we should. I already have your first book, and I'm really looking forward to reading this new one. And now that we hear you and all these, well, there's still a lot of there's so much going on in the subject, and I think it's a good basis for understanding these kind of conditions in a very revolutionary way. I think, honestly,
Yes.
I think
Yeah,
this is something
absolutely.
that we need So thank you very much. And we are going to do the closure of the event now, but you please stay with us. It's going to be in Spanish, but please stay with us. Don't go.
Thank you for having me, everyone. Thank you for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire.
Pues muchísimas gracias a la gente que nos siguió a lo largo de este maratón de conversaciones. Esperamos que todos nos hayamos movido del lugar, que nos hayamos quedado con muchísimas preguntas, que nos hayamos quedado con el ímpetu de pensar desde el área, desde el espacio en el que estamos, no pensaría en cómo podemos contribuir, pero cómo podemos pensar, cómo podemos hacernos responsables desde los espacios en los que estamos. Que yo creo que los temas que hemos tratado en estos días nos tocan a todos. Es algo que no es como que de pronto te enfrentas con ellos, sino es algo cotidiano, es algo, sobre todo, pensaría a lo mejor de la vida en la ciudad. Sí pensaría que estamos en circunstancias distintas. Pero bueno, si a partir de esto alguien quiere seguir la conversación, el Centro Multimedia está abierto a escucharlos, a seguir trabajando los temas. Sobre todo una cosa que siempre nos interesa es que no queden un par de charlas o en un par de conversaciones, sino que sean cosas que se vayan tejiendo con todo el trabajo que vamos haciendo. Pues yo estoy súper agradecida con Claudia y con Agustín, que se animaron a hacer este programa, que de pronto es como muy raro, ¿no? Porque está como en un lugar que no son las ciencias, no es el arte, no son las humanidades, no es la sociología, no pretende explicar nada, sino más bien intervenir los discursos que hay hasta ahora sobre los cuerpos. No está buscando una solución a un problema en específico, sino más bien está buscando como exponer que no hay como un antes, durante y después, ¿no? Sino que hay un sistema estructural pues que abarca a la vida de las personas y que muchas de las veces no podemos participar de muchas cosas que responden a cómo nos vemos, a cómo nos contamos, a cómo nos relacionamos. Entonces, pues eso, muchísimas gracias. No sé si Claudia o Agustín quieren agregar algo para cerrar.
Pues yo quisiera nuevamente agradecer a todos los ponentes, a Claire, Vivet, David, Ana María, Sven, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Ustedes, la tallera, al Centro Nacional de las Artes, por supuesto, ¿no? al Centro de Ciencias Genómicas, al posgrado de la División de Ciencias Sociales y Humanidades de la UAM Coajimalpa, porque creo que justamente, y menciono a todos los participantes, porque creo que este tipo de discusiones solo y construirse de una manera verdaderamente crítica cuando se involucran diferentes perspectivas y que se discute y se trata de entender los fenómenos desde toda esta diversidad, no solamente de disciplinaria, sino de experiencias de vida, ¿no? Y de experiencias de trabajo y de experiencias de maneras de relacionarnos socialmente. Entonces, yo les agradezco muchísimo, creo que son charlas, son discusiones que se tienen, como bien decía Elena, tener que tener con más apertura, mucho mayor frecuencia, no solo por la realidad del país, sino porque son temas que nos tocan a todos, ¿no? Que como bien decías, de alguna u otra forma todos nos vemos impactados por ello. Entonces, pues muchas gracias nuevamente a todas y a todos.
Sí, pues ya sin ánimos de repetir, pero muchas gracias a todas y todos. Creo, de nuevo, sí es algo bastante necesario. Y pues como dijo Elena sobre el Centro Multimedia, pues el Centro de Ciencias Genómicas también está abierto para continuar esta conversación, que seguramente conociéndonos veremos la manera de poder sacarla colectivamente y estarla trayendo constantemente para quien quiera participar. también pues es eso, es una invitación a quien quiera seguirse uniéndonos a este tipo de conversaciones o quien quiera repetir, pues son más que bienvenidas y bienvenidos.
Nos está diciendo Claire que podría tuitear
sobre su presentación.
Ajá. Perfecto.
Thank you very much, Claire.
Okay, we don't want to hold you more, Claire. Thank you very much for staying with us, and for this is. I hope this is the first of many other talks we can have. We are going to follow your work closer, and yes, please, if we can tweet, retweet, and all the tweets we can, and retweet your presentation, your ideas. That would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Lovely to talk to you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye there. Bye there.
Bye. Well, bueno, pues ya, vámonos, ¿no? Muchas gracias a la audiencia. Ojalá quieran compartir. Las charlas van a quedar en Facebook, están grabadas, y eventualmente las vamos a editar y las vamos a subir a nuestro canal de YouTube en el Centro Multimedia. Entonces, bueno, todas estas conversaciones van a quedar en archivo por si en algún momento las quieren consultar de nuevo.
Pues bye.
Bye.
Bye.